What would you sacrifice for the truth when love and loyalty stand against each other in a web of hidden secrets? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? The moment James Kong tore open the anonymous letter, his world tilted on its axis. Each printed word fell heavily into his mind, unraveling years of identity and expectations. You are the son of Kong Dae-hyun. The revelation echoed in his ears, drowning out the laughter of his colleagues at the architectural firm in Los Angeles, their faces blurring as shock gripped his heart. Could it be true? He had always lived a life far removed from any ancestral legacy, a solitary architect thriving on his own merits. But now, the mundane crumbled beneath the weight of an illustrious name, and his feet instinctively carried him to Seoul, the bustling heart of South Korea, where that name still reverberated through the skyscrapers like a ghost. Arriving at Incheon Airport, the air pulsed with energy and tantalizing sense of street food, yet it felt foreign to him, the surroundings an overwhelming juxtaposition to the calm streets he was used to. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the letter, its paper crumpling under his pressure. Two thoughts consumed him: his father's identity and the family he had never known. After a quick ride through Seoul's crowded streets, he found himself standing before the towering Kong Group headquarters. The sleek glass facade reflected not just the city but the enormity of the moment ahead. As he stepped inside, a chill swept over him. It wasn't only the corporate atmosphere, something deeper stung in the air. Before he could take a breath, he was met with cold hostility. Isabella Kong, the sharp-eyed heiress, stood at the center of a group of executives, her expression a mix of disdain and calculated indifference as she sized him up from head to toe. A flicker of recognition ignited in her gaze, transforming quickly into arrogant scorn. "What are you doing here, James?" she proclaimed with icy confidence. The executives around her shifted uncomfortably, but she stood her ground, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor, sounding like warnings. James felt the weight of their scrutinizing gazes, yet he stood tall. This was his chance to confront the shadows of his past. "I'm here for answers," he insisted, his voice steady despite the tension that electrified the air. He met Isabella's hard stare, mirroring her fierceness. "I deserve to know the truth about my father and my place in this family." Gasps of disbelief rippled through the room, but James stood undeterred. This was not a mere family reunion, it was a reckoning, and he could almost feel his heart pounding with each tick of the clock behind him. Meanwhile, Sophie Yu observed the entire scene from the outskirts, her keen journalist instincts peaked. One look at James, his resolve standing firm against Isabella's barrage of contempt, told her everything. This man was caught in a web thicker than mere family drama. Her reporter's mind raced as she pieced together that his sudden appearance had to be intertwined with the corruption she had been investigating within the Kong Group. Why had he come and how did he fit into this dangerous game? The thrill of a new lead ignited her determination. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward, eager to uncover more. "James Kong," she introduced herself, her voice cutting through the thick tension. His eyes narrowed as he regarded her warily, raising an eyebrow. "I'm a journalist," she continued, not backing down. "I know your arrival here has to do with something much bigger. I'd like to ask you a few questions." He waved her off, dismissing her as just another reporter eager to exploit his misfortune. James had little patience for the media, as they were often vultures circling tragedy. Yet, as the day unfolded, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that they were bound by fate. When she stumbled upon rumors of a missing one that could substantiate James's claims, her instincts screamed that they shared a common purpose beyond any ephemeral attraction. Curiosity and ambition mixed with her budding respect for the man standing against Isabella, and she knew she had to align her efforts with James. Intrigue flickered in her eyes as she considered the potential for a partnership, unaware of how their paths would soon intertwine in the labyrinth of the Kong Group's dark secrets. James found himself seated in the sleek, cold conference room of the Kong Group, the polished surface of the table gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. He felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him as the board of directors loftily scrutinized him, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and disdain. "If you wish to be recognized as a legitimate heir, you must demonstrate your worth," the chairman's sharp voice echoed in his ears, filled with the authority of a lifetime navigating boardrooms and deals. They were imposing figures, the kind who carried the weight of generations of ambition etched into their lined faces. Reluctance settled deep within James. The last thing he wanted was to prove himself in a realm he barely understood, a realm laden with tension and synergy he had only witnessed from afar. Yet, as he stared into the steely eyes of Isabella, who glared daggers of rivalry at him, a flicker of determination ignited within him. He had arrived in Seoul seeking the truth about his father, and he knew that if he needed to play this game to unlock the answers, he would. The thought raced through his mind as he accepted their challenge, convincing himself that revealing his father's legacy would ultimately lead him to the heart of this family's dark secrets. Meanwhile, something churned in the depths of Sophie Yu's investigative mind as she continued her relentless pursuit of the truth behind Kang Dae-hyun's puzzling death. Her intuition kicked into overdrive when she stumbled upon discrepancies in the official reports surrounding the chairman's untimely demise. Determined, she meticulously cross-checked documents over steaming cups of bitter coffee, her apartment cluttered with papers and old case files. The revelations felt tantalizingly close, it was almost palpable in the air. She had learned that the revered chairman had been on the verge of making a monumental announcement regarding a long-lost son before he perished in that inexplicable accident, a revelation that swirled with the stench of conspiracy. Intrigued by this sudden twist, Sophie's heart raced at the thought that his return might be linked to his father's death. Meanwhile, James delved into the corporate atmosphere of the Kang Group, feeling both lost and out of place as he observed the meticulous workflows and the understated elegance of the company culture. Each interaction left him with more questions than answers, fueling his need to connect the dots of his father's life. This corporate labyrinth, filled with unspoken rules and subtle power plays, felt foreign yet exciting. It urged him to dig deeper into the legacy that came with his name. The stakes were no longer just about inheritance, this was about identity and belonging. Just when James thought he might sink under the weight of uncertainty, Sophie chose that moment to approach him once again, armed with the secretive knowledge she had uncovered. She sensed his potential vulnerability after witnessing the flicker of resolve in his stance. "I know what you're trying to do," she said, locking eyes with him, honesty ringing through her voice like a bell. "You're searching for the truth about your father, just like I am." The words hung between them, forging an unexpected alliance as James felt the barriers he had erected begin to crumble. Sophie had shifted from a mere distraction to a vital source of support in his turbulent quest. He nodded slowly, acknowledging the gravity of their shared determination. In that moment, amidst the looming shadows of the Kang Group and the relentless pursuit of secrets, their fates intertwined as they stood on the precipice of discovery, prepared to challenge a legacy that sought to bury them both. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden hue over Seoul, James found himself standing on the impressive balcony of the Kang Group's headquarters, trying to absorb the whirlwind of emotions that had plagued him since arriving in South Korea. Each breath he took was thick with the perfume of unseen resentments. This was a world of high stakes where secrets flowed as freely as the fine wine being poured at the lavish company gala. He was both a participant and an outsider, an unwelcome specter at this gathering meant to celebrate the legacy of a father he never knew and a family that wished he had never appeared. Standing beside him was Sophie, her determined gaze focused on the crowd. The way she observed everything, scanning for clues among the glimmering lights and laughter, made James feel as though he was not facing this daunting reality alone. The tension between them was palpable. They had forged an alliance out of necessity, driven by the common pursuit of truth, while the air crackled with the electric undercurrent of their growing attraction. As they mingled among the elite, Sophie leaned closer to James, her voice soft, almost drowned out by the distant sound of elegant laughter. She shared her findings from the past few days, whispers of a missing will that had been haunting her thoughts since she had encountered it in a forgotten file. There was a glint of hope in her eyes as she said that if they could find the old lawyer who had once handled the Kang family's affairs, perhaps they could unlock the mystery surrounding Kang Dae-hyun's death. James, aware of the stakes, nodded in agreement, feeling the fire of determination igniting within him. They were in this together, navigating the complex layers of the Kang Group, and with each shared secret and fleeting glance, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. However, the balance of their budding partnership was tested in an instant when Isabella, dressed in an elegant gown that shimmered under the lights, sauntered over, her poise radiating arrogance. With a sharp smile that held no warmth, she made a show of embodying everything James had come to expect from her: ruthless, commanding, and unforgiving. "Is there something you'd like to say to the family, brother?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm that echoed throughout the grand hall. The noise of the party seemed to fade away as her words carved through the air, leaving James feeling exposed and vulnerable. It was a calculated blow, designed to remind everyone of James's position as the outsider, a reminder that he did not belong. Her laughter followed, sharp as glass, drawing the eyes of the crowd, leaving James struggling to regain his composure. Sophie, standing beside him, felt the heat rise in her cheeks, sensing the humiliation that washed over him as Isabella continued her cruel performance. Later, as the gala continued around them, Sophie's thoughts churned with the implications of Isabella's words, her own resolve hardening as she tucked away the thought of the missing will. She had received an anonymous tip earlier in the evening about an old lawyer named Lee Jun-won who had been closely tied to the family rumored to have seen the will before it vanished. She could feel her instincts kicking in, propelling her toward the next clue that could bring clarity and reveal the dark dealings within the Kang Group. She turned to James, who still wore the remnants of embarrassment on his face. "We need to find this lawyer. If anyone knows the truth, it's him," she insisted, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around them, feeding his determination. In the days that followed, James dove headfirst into the inner workings of the Kong Group, his architectural prowess transforming into an investigative sharpness as he scrutinized financial statements and dug into hidden accounts. The more he uncovered, the more questionable transactions began to emerge, hinting at something sinister beneath the surface. Isabella's demeanor seemed increasingly suspicious, her frantic actions leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs leading toward a nexus of greed and deceit that suggested she was embroiled in darker dealings than simple corporate rivalries. As he gathered evidence, a dual sense of purpose developed within him. While he was fighting to reclaim his legacy, he was also carefully peeling back the layers of deception as he grew closer to Sophie, a woman who, despite her own traumas, stood unyielding by his side, willing to confront the shadows of the past in conjunction with the burgeoning feelings that began to blossom between them. One evening, after countless hours spent poring over documents in the dim light of the office, James invited Sophie to join him on a walk outside, the chill in the air sharpening their senses as they strolled through the quiet streets of Seoul. The gentle hum of life around them contrasted sharply with the weight of their discoveries. It was as though they were living in two worlds at once. They shared laughter sporadically, but beneath it lay a current of intimacy that neither were willing to acknowledge fully. As they continued to search for answers, the thoughts of family, betrayal, and the allure of a connection that felt both invigorating and dangerous began to intertwine. In that moment, the city glinting like a sea of stars reflected the chaotic turmoil of their hearts and minds, a testament to the journey they were undertaking, fraught with peril, yet pulsing with the promise of something more substantial and precious, a promise they both yearned for but were afraid to name. James and Sophie had long since crossed the line from mere acquaintances to reluctant partners, both determined to unveil the truth surrounding the Kong Group's entanglements. The air in the abandoned lawyer's office was thick with dust and secrets, the only sounds being the creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of their clothing as they maneuvered through the dim space, illuminated only by the beam of James's flashlight. A sense of urgency gripped them as James whispered that they needed to find anything that might shed light on the mysterious circumstances surrounding his father's legacy. Sophie nodded, her heart racing not just from the thrill of the chase but also from the growing bond she felt towards him, battling against her independent nature. They sifted through stacks of neglected files, each piece of paper seeming to weigh heavier with the history of lies and betrayal that had surrounded the late chairman. It was Sophie who, driven by a sharp instinct, noticed a faint outline of a safe embedded within the wall, a substantial hint at the hidden treasures of truth they desperately sought. They exchanged hopeful glances, her pulse quickening with every second as James pressed carefully against the door of the safe, his brow furrowing in concentration. Miraculously, it clicked open, revealing a trove of documents that seemed to confirm James's existence as Dae-hyun's legitimate son. The implications unfurled before them like an intricate tapestry. These documents hinted at a very different narrative from the one Isabella perpetuated, one in which James belonged, had a right to claim alongside pieces of family history she had long suppressed. But just as their joy began to swell, the unexpected sound of footsteps approached, heavy and ominous, the distant murmur of voices echoing in the empty corridor sending chills down their spines. They barely had time to process the gravity of their find when security burst in, their uniforms stark against the backdrop of dust and shadows. Isabella, with a triumphant smirk on her face, emerged behind the guards, having orchestrated this moment as if it had been written into a cruel play. "Did you really think you could trespass here without consequences?" she taunted, her eyes glinting with malice as she seized the documents from James's shaking hands. In that moment, the weight of Isabella's disdain for his presence, her brotherly hostility, was both a challenge and an insult that coursed through James, igniting a fierce defiance as he insisted he would not abandon his pursuit for the truth. He voiced that every step he took toward unraveling Dae-hyun's past would only fuel his determination. But as security led him out, he caught a glimpse of Sophie's stricken face, her resolve flickering like a candle in a gale. In the days that followed, James grappled with the consequences of their failure while the fear of retaliation preyed on Sophie's mind. Each glance over her shoulder grew more anxious, sensing the predators lurking in the shadows, the phone calls that felt eerily timed, and the muffled whispers she overheard in hushed meetings. It was a silence laden with danger, turning her solitary investigation into a treacherous path she realized she could no longer walk alone. And while all this unfolded, Isabella, ever cunning, began crafting a narrative twisted enough to undermine James's legitimacy as an heir to the Kong legacy. She tainted public perception with skillful rumors, painting James as an opportunist with calculating motives, jeopardizing whatever ground he had gained by leveraging his recently discovered lineage. With each malicious word she spread, James felt the strain pull tighter, the very family he sought to understand pushing him further from acceptance. But even amidst this turmoil, a spark of determination lit within him, reminding him of his desire to uncover not only the truth about his father but also the truth about himself, who he was and where he belonged. In the midst of swirling uncertainty, James and Sophie found themselves drawn together by an inexplicable connection that thrived even in the face of adversity. Late one evening, sitting in a small cafe tucked away in the bustling streets of Seoul, they sought refuge from the relentless pressures of the Kong Group and its treacherous politics. The warm light from the overhead lamps cast a soft glow around them, wrapping their conversation in an intimate cocoon. Sophie, her brow furrowed with a mixture of determination and sadness, began to unveil layers of her life that had long remained hidden. As she took a deep breath, her voice trembled slightly, but she pressed on, sharing that her father, once a prominent executive within the ranks of the Kong Group, had been wrongfully accused of embezzlement in a scandal that had tarnished his name. The weight of her words hung in the air like a dense fog, enveloping them in the stark reality of betrayals that changed the course of her life. James listened intently, the shock of her confession igniting a fire within him. The notion that the very family he sought to claim might have destroyed her world sent shivers down his spine. He could see how this tragedy had sculpted Sophie into the fierce, unyielding journalist seated across from him. Touched by her vulnerability, he instinctively reached out, his hand brushing against hers as he promised to assist her in retrieving the justice she so desperately sought if she would help him dismantle Isabella's tight grip on the Kong Empire. This momentary contact sparked electricity between them, grounding their alliance with an undeniable emotional tether. When Sophie nodded in agreement, a sense of relief washed over James, but he also felt a nagging worry about how far they would need to go to unearth the truth. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to them, dark forces shifted in the shadows of the Kong Group. Han Min-suk, the cold and calculating chairman of the board, sat in a dimly lit room not far from where their conversation blossomed. The silence was thick with secrets, but he reveled in the chaos, a puppeteer orchestrating a play for power. In a hushed meeting with Isabella, he eyed her with a steely focus, revealing that he was the architect behind the scheme that had ensnared Sophie's father, framing him as a scapegoat to serve his own ambitions. This sinister revelation danced like a venomous serpent between them, with Isabella's ice-cold demeanor betraying nothing of her internal turmoil. She was ambitious and relentless, yet she understood that her ventures for control within the Kong Group meant she had to tread carefully around potential threats or allies. As they discussed their shared interests, shadows loomed larger over the future of both Sophie and James. In that hidden cafe, James and Sophie clung to their shared resolve, two unlikely partners ignited by their desire for justice, but they were unaware that dangers lurked around every corner, spurred on by old puppets wielding newfound strings. With mounting trepidation and mounting strength, they prepped themselves for the challenges ahead, knowing that this precarious dance between love and ambition would test the very fabric of their souls. The rain pattered softly against the windows of Sophie's tiny office as she leaned back in her chair, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration coursing through her veins. In her hands, she held a small recorder, the device humming gently with the vital evidence she had barely managed to extract from an unlikely source, a disgruntled former employee of the Kong Group who had been desperate for justice. The muffled voices captured on the tape were enough to send chills down her spine. They spoke of betrayal, secrets, and a plot so dark that it twisted her stomach. As she played the recording back, she could hear the conversation regarding Kang Dae-hyun's death and the chilling assertion that it was calculated, a murder masked as an accident, designed to ensure a smooth succession for Isabella. Realizing the depth of the conspiracy, Sophie felt a surge of determination, vowing to bring the truth to light. Yet, with the weight of her revelation came an overwhelming sense of vulnerability, knowing that the more she dug, the more she risked, not only for herself but for the fragile bond she had with James. Meanwhile, deep in the glass-walled offices of the Kong Group, tension filled the air as James faced Isabella. His heart raced with a mixture of fear and anger as he demanded answers that hung heavily between them like a dark cloud. He pressed her, his voice steely with resolve, insisting that she tell him what she knew about their father's death. Isabella, cool and composed, regarded him with an icy stare that cut through his fury. With a disdainful tilt of her head, she told him that he was never meant to be part of this world, her tone dripping with condescension. She continued to dismiss his pleas, striding past him like an unstoppable force, reminding him that survival in the ruthless corporate jungle depended on silence and complicity. "You should leave while you still can," she warned, her eyes swirling with a combination of disdain and cunning. James's mind raced as the weight of her words settled heavily upon him. This was a game of higher stakes than he had imagined, and he felt the walls closing in. Outside, rain continued to fall, streaking the windows like tears, reflecting the turmoil of the lives intertwined within the Kong legacy. As Sophie prepared to secure her findings for publication, her fervor turned to fear when she stepped into her office the following afternoon and found the room in chaos. Papers scattered across the floor, and her computer was missing, a chilling message left in its wake that told her to cease her investigation or face dire consequences. The room echoed with silence that felt heavy, the type of stillness that bore down on her shoulders and made breathing difficult. Panic surged inside her, but tempered by the steely resolve she had cultivated over the years, she reminded herself of her father's unjust fate and the relentless pursuit of the truth that had driven her this far. She gritted her teeth, refusing to be intimidated, convinced that the discovery of Han Min-suk's role would cement everything she had worked for. Before the storm within her could settle, her phone buzzed furiously, drawing her attention. It was James. His voice came through, tinged with urgency and anger, demanding to meet. The electric tension between them crackled via the phone lines, and Sophie steeled herself for their confrontation. He was desperate for answers, and the knowledge that they had both been pawns in a far more sinister game began to weave their fates closer together. Still, doubt flickered in her mind about whether revealing the truth would only bring about further destruction, not just for herself but for James, who was already entangled in so many unseen dangers. As she looked out at the city beyond her office, an image of James flashed through her mind, his confident smile battling against the facade of the powerful King Group, and she realized that the path they walked would either lead them to salvation or obliteration. As the sun dipped below the Seoul skyline, casting deep shadows across the bustling city, the air buzzed with a mix of tension and uncertainty. News of Sophie's father being a former executive at the Kong Group had spread like wildfire, stoking the flames of public scrutiny. Standing on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking Han River, James felt the weight of betrayal crushing down on him. He had believed in Sophie, found solace in their shared mission, but the public's reaction was fierce, painting her as an unreliable journalist on a personal vendetta against the Kong family. With the media clamoring for details, Isabella had succeeded in turning public opinion against Sophie, saying that she had ulterior motives. In the midst of the chaos, James could only think about how quickly things had spiraled out of control, and he felt the flicker of doubt creeping into his heart, bringing with it a sense of isolation. He said that he had to distance himself from her for both their sakes, but deep down, he agonized over the decision, wondering if he was losing the one person who truly understood him. Sophie, meanwhile, packed her bags in a small, dimly lit apartment, memories of her moments with James flashing through her mind like a film reel. She could still feel the warmth of his presence, the way he listened to her dreams, the late-night conversations filled with hopes of justice. Tears blurred her vision as she recalled how he had promised to stand by her. Yet here he was, falling for Isabella's accusations, unable to see the truth of her intentions. With her heart heavy, she decided to leave Seoul, believing that her mission was over, that the truth she sought would remain buried beneath the weight of powerful lies. She responded by saying that walking away was the only choice left to her, as another tear escaped, tracing down her cheek, a silent testament to her defeat. The following days revealed the aftermath of the media frenzy, with Isabella tightening her grip on the Kong Group. She appeared publicly with poise and elegance, exuding confidence that masked a deep-seated fear. As the executives fell in line with her plans, James watched from the sidelines, feeling more like an outsider than ever before. Each passing day hardened his resolve to prove himself, yet doubts tormented him, his thoughts swirled around whether he had been naive to think that he could trust anyone in this ruthless world. His father's legacy felt tainted by the truth and the facade that surrounded him, leaving him grappling with a sense of identity that seemed increasingly elusive. It wasn't until he found himself in the emptiness of his office, papers strewn across the table with the weight of unanswered questions, that he realized how lost he had become since pushing Sophie away. The city buzzed with life outside his window, yet within him was a growing void, an echo of her laughter that once filled the spaces between his thoughts. The more he replayed their conversations, the more he recognized the authenticity in her passion. He thought about how she had shared her fears and vulnerabilities and realized that her fight was also his. He decided that he had to bring her back. But his path was obstructed by Isabella's machinations. She had been swift and ruthless, spinning narratives that reinforced her stance while suffocating James's every move. As he contemplated a plan to disrupt her hold on the company, he wondered how he could ever dismantle her web of deceit without Sophie by his side. His resolve hardened, he could no longer afford to let fear dictate his actions. Either he would confront Isabella, revealing her manipulations, or he would challenge her directly, knowing that it was only with Sophie's partnership that he would find the strength to face the storm. The realization crashed upon him that he had underestimated the power of their connection, that perhaps Sophie was not merely an ally but a grounding force he needed to reclaim for himself. In that moment, James made a decision: he wouldn't just reclaim his identity or challenge Isabella. He would fight for Sophie, lifting the burden of their unspoken feelings, proving that love could indeed flourish in the ashes of betrayal. He remembered her selflessness, her fierce loyalty, and despite the odds, he was determined to find a way back to her, to show her that laying down arms was never an option, especially when they shared the same goal of unmasking the truth. As he set out towards her favorite cafe, a place where their laughter had intertwined, he felt the shadows of doubt spurred by Isabella slowly lifting, ignited by a newfound hope. The taste of coffee hung in the air, mingled with the anticipation of reconciliation. He had to convince her that they were stronger together, that their fight was not just personal but part of a larger quest for justice that could not be abandoned. The journey had been tumultuous, marked by loss and betrayal, but it was also one of new beginnings, and he was determined to start anew, with Sophie by his side, ready to unveil the truth together. Determined to reclaim his rightful place and dismantle the web of deceit woven by Isabella and Han Min-suk, James plunged into the shadows of the Kong Group's empire, his fingers dancing across the keys of his laptop as he scoured through digital records. Each click sent jolts of adrenaline through him, the thrill of the chase igniting a fierce resolve within. The news of Isabella's ruthless maneuvers loomed over him like an oppressive storm cloud, tightening his chest every time he imagined her suave smile masking sinister ambitions. His search led him to an old employee, a retired lawyer who once served under Kang Dae-hyun, tucked away in the recesses of a rundown cafe where the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the air, mingling with whispers of forgotten tales. As James settled into a booth, the creaking leather seat familiarizing him with his anxious thoughts, he found the lawyer, eyes clouded with uncertainty but sparking with hidden knowledge, and immediately felt a connection to characters of old stories that he hoped were not as bleak as they seemed. The lawyer's hands trembled as he produced faded papers from a worn briefcase, detailing Kang Dae-hyun's real will, which promised everything James needed to overthrow Isabella's grasp on the Kong Group. The air grew thick with unspoken threats. The will was not just a document, it was a weapon that could shatter the delicate facade of power. Convinced that every moment counted, James barely had time to express his gratitude before he whisked away the papers, tucking them into his coat pocket, where they felt like molten gold promising immeasurable power. Meanwhile, Sophie, too, felt the weight of their shared battle pressing down upon her as she dived deeper into her investigation, wrestling with the memories of her father's ruin intertwined with the Kong family's treachery. The pale glow of her laptop illuminated her determined face as she unraveled a trail leading to a hidden account connected to Han Min-suk, one that whispered of illicit transactions and untraceable money. Buried under layers of deceit, she sensed the urgency in the chaos. The deeper she probed, the more precarious her situation became. She knew that every piece of evidence brought her closer to the truth, but also closer to danger lurking in the shadows, waiting to extinguish her flame of conviction. Returning to Seoul, she could almost feel the pulse of the city beneath her feet as she stepped off the train, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Addressing the chaos stirring within her, she reminded herself that this was more than a job, it was a path to redemption, not just for her but for James as well. They both needed closure, and for that, they needed to stand united. Fate seemed to conspire in their favor when James and Sophie found themselves meeting at a secluded park where cherry blossoms showered them with fragile petals like gentle whispers of hope. As James revealed the documents that he secured, Sophie's eyes widened. He placed the will in her hands, the weight of their shared burden suddenly lifting as she grasped the significance of what lay before them. He passionately said that this was their moment, the turning point they so desperately needed, and while a bittersweet tension hung in the air, their connection solidified amidst the chaos surrounding them. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Sophie responded by saying that this was it. They were now cornered but fighting back, ready to bring light to the hidden corruption in the Kong Group. The resolve in their voices ignited an unbreakable bond forged through shared pains and aspirations as their hearts began to beat in sync. Together, they plotted their next moves, knowing full well that the road ahead was fraught with peril. Each plan felt like an unlit match waiting for the spark that would either ignite a fire of truth or leave them burnt in the ashes of corporate greed and betrayal. Standing on the precipice of danger, they were both acutely aware that exposing the truth could very well cost them their lives, yet it was also the only path to redemption they had. As darkness threatened, a light flickered in their hearts, illuminating the shared resolve that propelled them forward into the storm, knowing they would face it together, two kindred spirits becoming warriors in the fight for justice. The atmosphere was electric as James and Sophie stood before the sea of journalists and cameras at the press conference, the weight of their revelations hanging heavily in the air. The long table before them was lined with documents that glistened under the bright lights, proof of the intricate web of lies spun by the Kong Group. As he glanced at the crowd, James felt the pulse of anticipation thrumming against the backdrop of intense scrutiny. He had spent months fighting for his rightful place, not just in the family but in his own identity, and now was the moment where everything would finally be laid bare. The murmurs of the journalists quieted as James stepped forward, striking a powerful figure clad in a tailored suit that spoke of renewal and purpose. He began with a steady voice, asserting the truth that had eluded him for so long. He spoke of Isabella's deceit in appropriating power meant for others, detailing her fraudulent actions that had been meticulously documented in the files they gathered. As the words flowed from him, he could sense a palpable shift. The air tingled with revelation as the journalist scribbled furiously, the overwhelming pressure of the moment feeding his resolve. Sophie stood resolute beside him, her expression a mixture of determination and relief. This was not just a victory for James, it was for her father, long wronged by the very system they were now dismantling. She emphasized the connections they uncovered, the money that had changed hands under the table, and the secrets that led to the tragic death of Kang Dae-hyun. As Sophie spoke, the crowd leaned in, captivated, and James could see a flicker of hope in her eyes as if they were finally on the cusp of justice. The camera flashes illuminated their faces like a powerful spotlight, and the tension that had shrouded them for so long began to dissolve, replaced by a burgeoning sense of triumph. Their united front symbolized more than just a partnership, it represented a shared pursuit of truth in a world marred by deception. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to them, Isabella was already spiraling into chaos backstage. Her world, meticulously crafted with lies and manipulation, was crumbling around her as she watched the damning evidence unfold on screens and monitors. Cold sweat dripped down her spine as she realized that the noose was tightening. In a desperate bid for escape, Isabella swept through the back corridor toward the rear exit, her tailored dress fluttering like a ghostly whisper of her fading power. Yet fate had other plans. The echo of her heels clicking against the marble floors was abruptly interrupted by the entrance of security, alerted to her frantic movements. Moments later, as she approached the airport, ready to leave it all behind, the thudding footsteps of law enforcement behind her signaled the end. Offering no resistance, she felt her heart sink as they led her away in handcuffs, the once commanding heiress now reduced to a figure of disgrace, her ambition for control turning into a nightmare of her own making. Back at the press conference, the situation mounted further as James revealed the hidden recordings Sophie had retrieved, evidence that Han Min-suk had conspired to wash away the truth of his brother's demise. The stakes were raised even higher when Sophie leaned into the microphone to unveil how the once revered chairman had manipulated finances, orchestrating his own rise to power through treachery. Han Min-suk, lurking in the shadows, could feel the weight of the public scrutiny descend upon him like a crushing wave. He had mastered the art of deception for years, but now the shackles of truth began to constrict around him as journalists bombarded him with questions about his involvement. The growing fear in his eyes was unmistakable as James revealed the extensive evidence linking him to fraud, tightening the grip of accountability and forcing him to confront the reality of his fall from grace. As Isabella's saga came to a close and Han Min-suk's duplicity unraveled before the world, the Kang Group was thrust into turmoil, the board members scrambling to salvage their reputation amidst the tsunami of bad press. Waves of panic rippled through the office as executives mobilized to contain the damaging fallout, bracing for the potential of a corporate apocalypse. James, however, remained unfaltered even as offers poured in from the remaining members of the board, extending control of the company to him in hopes of restoring its former glory. "This is not what I want," he said, his voice reflecting a newfound clarity as he glanced at Sophie, knowing that true power could never originate from wealth or position. He had found strength in integrity and purpose, vowing to forge a path of his own, one driven by his passion for architecture and a commitment to positive change. Months later, as the dust settled and the chaos morphed into resolution, James established an architectural firm, one rooted in sustainability and integrity, turning his back on the corporate politics that had once ensnared him. Sophie, meanwhile, published her exposé, restoring her father's name and standing tall against the demons of the past. On the opening day of James's new project, they found themselves reunited amid the cacophony of laughter and chatter, their connection rekindled, not overshadowed by the haunting shadows of their shared history. As he extended an invitation for her to collaborate on future endeavors, Sophie smiled, her heart warming with a mix of gratitude and hope. Together, they walked through the vibrant streets of Seoul, ready to embrace not just their individual dreams, but a future woven together by trust, love, and a shared mission for a better world, this time, free of the chains that had once held them captive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over Seoul, James stood among the impressive steel and glass structures that now surged with life under his watchful eye. His architectural firm had begun to flourish, each project a testament to his commitment to sustainable development and a reflection of the new beginnings he had fought so hard for. People admired the buildings, not merely for their design but for the stories they told, stories of resilience, love, and redemption. Sophie, ever by his side, had become a vital part of his journey, bringing her fierce determination to uphold integrity and justice to his vibrant world. The opening day of his latest project was a blend of excitement and nostalgia, and as he glanced at her radiant smile, he felt the weight of the past lift, replaced with a promise of a brighter future. They both reminisced about the shadows that had loomed over them, the treacherous paths they had traversed to arrive at this pivotal moment. James, still touched by the scars of his past, knew that the battle with the remnants of the Kong group's darkness might not be completely over. Whispers of potential threats lingered in the air, like an unshakable tension before a storm, and he couldn't help but wonder if his father's legacy would forever be tainted by the sins of the past. Sophie seemed to share this unease, and they exchanged knowing glances, each silently acknowledging the resolve that had brought them closer than ever. As they strolled through the bustling city streets, the laughter and chatter around them filled the void left by the tumultuous events of their lives. Yet, they were cautious, aware of the forces still at play, even in their newfound peace. It was in those moments of buoyancy and trepidation that they made a pact unspoken, igniting a spark of adventure deep within their hearts. They planned to venture beyond their individual careers, to make a mark that would not just be remembered, but would also shield others from the dark entanglements they had escaped. With each step, they imagined new horizons and challenges to conquer, knowing that together, they could illuminate any shadows that dared approach them. Just then, Sophie glanced at a newspaper vendor who was loudly announcing the latest headlines, her playful curiosity prompting James to take a look. His brows furrowed slightly as he caught wind of a familiar name linked to a brewing corporate scandal, powerful and menacing, yet strangely alluring. This was no coincidence. Perhaps the past still had a grip on them, or perhaps a new chapter was waiting to unfold. The air between them crackled with unending possibilities that hung thick, and their intertwined hands tightened as they prepared to confront whatever came their way. As the first stars began to twinkle against the twilight backdrop, they knew their story was far from finished. A new adventure beckoned, one ripe with intrigue and ripe with potential, stretching far beyond the skyline of Seoul, where shadows may linger but love and courage would always light their way. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.